How's it going, everyone? I'm really excited to have Dr. Alka Chandna, Vice President of Laboratory Investigations at PETA, and a dear friend of mine, especially since we've had some of the biggest news, I'd say, in the history of animal rights over the last couple of weeks. And I haven't seen enough attention paid to this, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, because you and PETA have done so much hard work on this. But can you just tell us what happened with Envigo, a beagle production facility over the last few weeks that's such important and groundbreaking news for the animals?
Sure thing, Wayne, and thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to chat with you. And we've chatted about this offline and in association with Ridglan, your investigation. So PETA, of course, does undercover investigations. Those are sort of, they're the heart and soul of PETA, are undercover investigations. And back in 2021, we did an undercover investigation. This means that we sent someone into a facility. She got a job at this facility, Envigo, which was a dog breeding facility in Cumberland, Virginia, which is outside of Richmond, Virginia, about an hour outside. And this is a place, basically a factory farm, where they bred beagles to then sell the beagles to research facilities, to experimentation laboratories, where they would be tormented and killed. So this facility, our investigator documented just horrendous conditions. We can get into that. But the long and short of it is that it was shuttered, which is huge. And the Department of Justice and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, slapped Envigo with a $22 million fine and an additional set of penalties totaling $13 million. So in total, around $35 million against the company. And now Envigo had been purchased by another company called Innovative. And so it's Innovative that's been left with this bill for violations of the Animal Welfare Act and the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, and that's a mind-blowing figure because historically fines have been so piddling. The Inspector General of the USDA has repeatedly issued these reports that I'm sure you're familiar with that have described the fines as, quote, basically meaningless. And the last figure I looked at, which I think was from 2018, I think in the entire year of 2018, they issued fines totaling I believe it was $130,000 for the entire year for all of the thousands upon thousands of vivisection facilities across the country. In this case, you have one facility with obviously a lot of dogs being cruelly mistreated, but essentially one case where they're being cited for an Animal Welfare Act violation, and it's tens of millions of dollars, which this is the thing that's going to make these companies start to pay attention. Because at the end of the day, you take their dogs away, you slap on the wrist with a teaching moment, whatever penalty the USDA normally issues, it's not going to make much of a difference. But you force them to pay tens of millions of dollars, that's when the executives start paying attention. So how did this happen? Because normally, it's hard to even get them to inspect these facilities properly, much less fine them tens of millions of dollars. So can you just explain to me to the extent you understand, how the hell did this happen?
It's a massively long saga, Wayne, but I want to corroborate what you said about the Inspector General reports. One of the reports back in 2005, we've been monitoring the reports since 1995. And, every time a report is issued about how the USDA attempts to enforce the Animal Welfare Act, the reports always say things like the facilities view any fines as the cost of conducting business. They just put it into their spreadsheets. They're not concerned about the fact that they're not giving veterinary care to animals, that the animals are living in deplorable, ramshackle conditions, in harmful conditions, that they're forced into confinements that are even smaller than the already embarrassingly low standards that are legal. So we've seen that facilities, institutions, laboratories, don't seem to be particularly invested in complying. And you're absolutely right. The fines are just horrendously low. We can chat more about that. But to get to the saga of this Envigo facility, I don't know how far back you want me to go, but
As
way
far
back.
back as you think is interesting. I mean, you've been doing this
Oh
since
man.
2017. I guess for you, it goes even further back than that. But 2017 is when I first heard about kind of
Yeah.
the stuff that you've been doing at Envigo.
So Envigo, that facility in Cumberland, it used to be owned by a company called Covance, and
Mm-hmm.
Covance used to be called. It just slipped my
It
mind.
used to be HLS, right? Huntington Life Sciences back in the day.
HLS became Envigo.
Yeah. Okay. HLS
You know,
became.
these companies are so crazy, and you know it's kind of deliberate, where
Mm-hmm.
they go by a certain name, and then they change. They might have some kind of PR nightmare. So Covance used to be called something else, which I will remember in 20 minutes. But Covance used to be called something else. They had a facility in Reston, Virginia. They used to import primates, non-human primates, monkeys, from other countries. In 89, 90, they had multiple shipments of monkeys who were infected with Ebola, the
Mm-hmm.
hemorrhagic virus, or the virus that causes hemorrhagic disease. And these monkeys were extremely sick, were bleeding out of their eyes and ears and other orifices. And that company killed all of the monkeys. The U.S. Army was brought in, CDC was brought in, huge, nightmare for them. And this was in Reston, Virginia, which is less than an hour from where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. And so the monkeys were all killed. The company changed its name to Covance. That was just a, changing of name of one company to another name for the sheer purpose of distancing themselves from this PR nightmare, which was the Ebola monkeys. And in fact, it was this new form of Ebola that was actually aerosolized. It could aerosolize,
Wow.
which means that, any humans near those monkeys could be contaminated. I mean, we humans got lucky because this particular strain of Ebola didn't sicken human beings. But had it, I mean, we would have been seeing really horrendous outcomes for all of the humans who were in contact with those monkeys, which was a considerable number. But so then you had Covance. Back in 2005, 2006, PETA did an undercover investigation of a Covance laboratory in Vienna, Virginia, which is also in the DC suburbs. And just to go on with your whole, the point that you were making earlier about low fines, we did a 9-month undercover investigation of Covance's primate laboratory. So this is where pharmaceutical companies would pay Covance as a contract lab to forcibly get monkeys to ingest test pharmaceuticals, like new pharmaceuticals. So the monkeys were used basically as test tubes, and they were gavaged every day. So a thick plastic tube was thrust up their nostril into their stomach or down their throat, into the stomach every day for, maybe 5 weeks or even longer than a year. And the monkeys would sicken, especially the ones in the high dose groups. Anyway, I worked on that investigation, and it was absolutely horrific because the monkeys were getting sick and they were dying in their cages, and there wasn't any veterinary care. And even when monkeys would, say, break a bone or dislocate a shoulder, there was no veterinary care given for them, because the company just couldn't be bothered. This was a company that, raked in hundreds of millions of dollars every single year back then, in 2005, and yet couldn't be bothered to have a veterinarian taking care of these monkeys. There were thousands of monkeys there and many other animals as well, dogs, mice, rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, and so on. But our person was focused, she was hired as a primate technician. And at the end of the day, there were also like workers who, when you think about these facilities, you have the animal technicians, they're getting paid minimum wage or just a little bit more than that. And they're doing literally the shit work. They're cleaning the cages. They're, ostensibly checking on the animals to make sure they're not sick. They write it up. probably nobody's going to check on the animals after that, but they write it up. And these are people who really occupy some of the lower echelons of our society, and they're being required to do this difficult work. Monkeys are very intelligent animals, obviously, and they don't like being confined in this cage where they can only walk 1 or 2 steps in any direction, deprived of everything that would be meaningful to them, deprived even of companionship. And so they
force fed all these toxins, because gavage that's a very brutal process. It's not.
Oh, absolutely.
These animals are not. I don't think they're anesthetized. I know dogs are not.
That's
I imagine
right.
monkeys are not either. So you get this tube just shoved down your throat, and you get pumped with poison every single day. It's not going to be very pleasant to handle these animals every day, and this is what these technicians are doing.
Exactly. And, because the monkeys resist, as, anybody in that circumstance would, some of the workers were really violent, and they would be manhandling the monkeys and shaking them and smacking them and throwing them into cages. It was really awful, really awful. And the USDA, to its credit, did, they're required, after we submit a complaint, they're required to go in and check out what's going on and see whether our allegations hold any water. And they found that the allegations did hold water, that in fact workers were really barbaric. They were physically and psychologically violent toward the monkeys. They found that there wasn't veterinary care, inadequate environmental enrichment that resulted in monkeys circling in their cages, self-mutilating, biting at their own flesh, pulling out their hair. There were monkeys who had pulled out all of their hair. Wayne, when you talk to primatologists about what goes on in laboratories and just the extreme psychological distress that these monkeys are under, what they talk about is the fact that, these monkeys know that they can't control anything in their lives. They know it's exactly what you just said. They know that they're being poisoned, that they're being, something is being done to them that is making them unwell, and that they don't feel well, and they might, exhibit nausea or hair loss or diarrhea, or their skin, starts falling off and their tissue becomes necrotic, all of these things, and they can't do anything about it. And the one thing they can control is the hair on their bodies, and they pull out the hair on their bodies because they can control that. So the USDA found all of these problems, corroborated, what we documented in our investigation, and they fined Covance $8,000. $8,000. A company that, was netting hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Massive company. Yeah. So that's when Covance came onto my radar back in 2005, 2006, when we did that undercover investigation.
And mind-blowing. So they find this horrific abuse of monkeys. They're literally tearing their own hair out. And by the way, necrotic, that means just basically dead tissue. That is on a living animal. And we see that on factory farms. We see that in laboratories too, because so often animals have wounds, they have injuries, they're not being treated, and their tissue is literally dying. These are almost like zombie creatures, partially dead, partially living in these facilities. And mind-blowing that 10 years after this initial investigation PETA did, this place is still in operation and still housing thousands of dogs and still houses thousands of monkeys too, right? In Virginia?
So the facility where we had our undercover investigation was in Vienna, Virginia. And so Covance had its what they call research products. I apologize, to you, Wayne, and to your followers, to the people who follow your podcast, for calling it that, but that is what the company was called, Covance Research Products.
Research products, yeah.
And by research products, they mean animals.
Dogs and monkeys.
So Covance had its research products wing, for example, the dog facility, and then they also had research products facilities down in Alice, Texas, and these were facilities where they would be importing monkeys, and they warehouse them there, maybe breed them more, and then ship them around. So the monkey facilities, and then smaller animals like breeding guinea pigs, mice, rats, and other animals. And they have numerous such facilities across the country and around the world. These are global mega companies, multinationals. So Covance had that part of its business, and then they also had the contract testing laboratories. So the facility in Vienna was a contract testing laboratory where, for a fee, they would test whatever you wanted on animals, and they also do non-animal testing. But the bigger part of their business historically had been animal testing. And so the place in Vienna, Virginia, is now closed. It closed down. And Ingrid Newkirk actually did a really lovely video where she went to that location, which was the site of so much barbaric behavior, so much violence and death and pain and misery. And, now it's a beautiful field, and it's sort of like reverted back to nature. The buildings are gone, everything's gone, and it's beautiful. The place in Cumberland was one of Covance's research products. So that was where they did dog breeding, and specifically beagle breeding.
Okay, so let's fast forward then to 2017 when you get these inspection documents from the USDA, and I just looked at the email and some of the FOIA documents this morning that you sent to me, and it's the thing that's honestly pretty surprising to me is how detailed some of these inspection reports are, because I'm so used to looking at inspection reports where it just says no non-compliances, no non-compliances. And even if there's a non-compliance, it's very vague and it's like not clear exactly what's happening. And, for some reason, I think there are not just one, but multiple inspection reports. And I don't think it's necessarily because Envigo was much worse in other vivisection facilities. There was one inspector in particular that I saw repeatedly, this person, Diana Kerr. Maybe we shouldn't even name her, honestly. Maybe we'll edit that out. Because I'm almost worried she's going to get targeted. Because I think getting some of these people inside the institution or trying to do the right thing, I'm sure it's hard. But what do you think it was about these FOIA documents you got in 2017 and then the investigation you did, I think it was in 2021, that led to this kind of historic shift in the way USDA was handling animal cruelty at experimentation facilities?
Yeah, you make a really good point, Wayne. Not like all USDA inspectors are not created equal. There's no question that there are some inspectors that do a really good job and write these detailed inspection reports. And we've had conversations with some inspectors, around our case with Eastern Virginia Medical School, which is a totally different situation. But in those conversations that we had with inspectors and supervisors at USDA, we saw that people were real. There are people who really care. They may not be like us, animal rights activists, right? They don't buy into the full philosophy, but they believe in animal welfare and they believe in enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. The problem is that you can have, and we will get into this, you can have the inspectors, who are going out and looking at the facilities, and they can see what's going on and decide, Jesus, this is really bad. We have to write this up. And then they write the detailed thing. The inspectors know that facilities like Covance, like these massive facilities, they don't want these violations to be documented in a report. And so they're going to fight back. And so the inspectors will do really good due diligence and take photos and take videos and know which dogs they're talking about so that there's a paper trail to go back to those individual dogs, that they didn't get veterinary care, that this dog had a tumor the size of an orange on her body, that these particular cages had 3 inches of feces piled up with mold growing on top, that these particular containers of food had bugs going through them, that there were cockroaches crawling through these containers of food. And so
all things that were actually found at Envigo, I think. All those things you listed were actually found at Envigo.
Yeah. And so when we saw that report, we submitted a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request to the USDA to request any photos or videos that were captured by the inspector when they were at the facility. And then in 2018, we actually received that documentation.
Oh. So what do you think it is that leads to some investigators being able to kind of push forward through all that? Because I agree. I mean, the sense I get from talking to people at the USDA, I mean, I spoke to the chief veterinarian of the Food Safety Inspection Service. This is an Animal Welfare Act stuff, but in many ways, from a human perspective, it's even more important because this is inspections in the Poultry Products Inspection Act, the Humane Slaughter Act that relate to human safety. And he told me that, yeah, even when we find serious zoonotic diseases that could spread into the human population, we can't really fight against the industry effectively. And I think the exact quote that he ended up giving to the New York Times was, "No one dares to stand up to big ag, not even the US government." So, I mean, given that there's a decades-long history of the USDA not enforcing the Animal Welfare Act and their own Inspector General, I don't think we explained exactly what the Inspector General is. The Inspector General is the internal watchdog of the USDA, who for decades was saying that fines and enforcement, and this is a direct quote from, I think it's their 2005 report, that the fines and enforcement mechanisms are, quote, basically meaningless. I remember that till the day I died, because I read that and I thought, this is ridiculous. And they find the same thing every single time they go back and look at animal welfare act enforcement. So what changed in 2017? I'm still kind of blown away about what changed in 2017 that led to this path to Envigo closing and now this historic fine. I mean, do you have a sense? Because I don't get it. I mean, it's amazing. Well, it's a miracle. But
things didn't change at USDA. And I'll explain what I mean. So even in 2017, with that crazy inspection report with all of the things that I just detailed, you know, the inches of feces, mold growing on top, the tumor on the dog's mammary chain, you know, other dogs who didn't get veterinary care, etc. There was an inspection report. An inspection report is just that. It's just a report. It's a piece of paper, you know, and it gets filed. And what normally happens, well, what I should say is what can happen at USDA when things like that are documented, when things that are deemed to be really problematic, causing harm to animals, you know, that's outside of what's permitted by law. You know, we're just talking about the Animal Welfare Act and its regulations. You know, there's nothing illegal about confining the animals. There's nothing illegal about using animals as breeding machines and then selling off their infants to laboratories where they're going to be tortured and killed. You know, all of that is perfectly legal. But within the confines of what's legal and illegal, you know, basically the animal welfare standards that make up the animal that are associated with the Animal Welfare Act. When you look at the regulations and the USDA deems that an institution has gone so far astray in violating those regulations, those animal welfare standards, what the USDA can do is kick the case over to their investigative and enforcement services, which then can undertake an investigation. Sorry, there's cat fur everywhere here. But can undertake an investigation. So an inspection of a place like Covance / Envigo, you know, a place that has 4,000, 5,000 beagles, you know, that might take a few hours. And the inspector goes in, looks at some of the dogs, looks at some of the records, talks to some of the employees, and she writes up the inspection report. And that gets filed. Her supervisor and then the director of Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Animal Care, that person will determine whether this case should go to IES, Investigative and Enforcement Services. And IES then takes the case and they will open a formal investigation. The formal investigation can take a year or longer. And so this is a much more intensive undertaking where they talk to a lot more people, look at more animals, you know, do, you know, a more thorough look at a facility. But in 2017, USDA didn't refer the case over to IES. Now, IES is the only entity you know, within that realm that can actually bring fines or bring some kind of enforcement action a decision or order or a legal complaint. The USDA can file a legal complaint against an institution, and even seize animals if they find that individual animals are in terrible harm, in jeopardy. So USDA didn't do that in 2017. And then PETA, when we got this information, we publicized it, and there was a lot of effort in Richmond, Virginia, which is, of course, the capital of the Commonwealth of Virginia, with legislators. My colleague, Daphna Nikminovich, who heads up our investigations unit and also spends a lot of time in Richmond working with legislators on a whole raft of issues. She was going to legislators and showing them what we had found through our FOIA request. And, because this is something right there in the Commonwealth, something in Virginia, where there's a horrendous situation for beagles. And a lot of the legislators are really worried and concerned about what they were seeing. And so there was a set of bills that was put forward by some of the animal-friendly legislators in Virginia back then in 2018. And we really thought, and these were, relatively speaking, pretty modest bills aimed at transparency and accountability, primarily. And there appeared to be a lot of support in the legislature. And then in the end, Envigo, because it was Envigo then, they hired the most expensive lobbying firm in Richmond, and the whole thing was quashed, and everything, fell apart. Nothing, there was no positive outcome from all of that effort. And of course, this was extremely frustrating to us. Some of the entities that defend vivisection to their dying breath never seen a lab they wouldn't be happy to defend, never seen, an experiment that they didn't think was just hunky-dory, probably never saw an animal they wouldn't like to take a scalpel to. These people, like the National Association for Biomedical Research, speaking of research, Foundation for Biomedical Research, all of them started spinning their wheels, and they sent up from Texas one of their spokespeople, a woman named Cindy Buckmaster, and she went and she talked about how important it was. Yeah. She talked about how important it was to use dogs in experimentation, how we would all die tomorrow if we weren't vivisecting dogs. And so the whole thing fell apart. So fast forward then to 2021, when we did our undercover investigation.
Can I ask you a question about that? The legislative effort? What did the legislators say in response? Did they give an explanation? Because I've faced so many similar situations, and one of the most disturbing things about what happens when the industry calls in their expensive lobbyists is that legislators don't even give you an answer. They just ghost you. So it's not like they've actually been convinced. It just feels like they've been bribed, essentially. Did you guys have that experience in 2018?
I wouldn't say that we had that experience. I would say that the people who helped write the bills, the people who wrote the bills, or whose staff wrote the bills, the people who were pushing the bills forward, I mean, they're bona fide animal people, and we're talking about dogs here. So,
sure. Yeah, so it's different.
People who care about dogs. And, anybody with vision could see that what was going on at Envigo was not okay. So those people, they felt the sting of defeat as much as we did. And they were also really unhappy with how that all came in. Shook out. I mean, I would say that there were definitely legislators who, claimed to be animal friendly, who claimed to care about the beagles, who just kind of rolled over when those expensive lobbyists came in and when Cindy Buckmaster flew to town. And, I was there and saw all of this, unfolding, and it was really demoralizing.
Sure.
The
worst example of this for me is this is not a case involving dogs. Peter was involved in this, so you might be somewhat familiar with this, but in Chicago back in, 2006, there was a ban on foie gras that was passed, 49-1 in favor. And then the Illinois Restaurant Association hired the former chief of staff of Mayor Richard Daley to lobby for them. And it went from 49-1 in favor to 36-6 against almost instantly, and a bunch of abstentions, basically no votes. And we didn't get an explanation from anyone. We just go to these aldermen and say, like, hey, what happened? I thought you were against animal torture, and they just wouldn't even respond. And it just felt very, very broken and corrupt. In that case, too, for us, I mean, Joe Moore, the alderman who had authored the bill, was super supportive and continued to fight for it. But he just kind of said, yeah, this is the way politics works. I mean, these connections and influence have enormous impacts on what legislators actually do. And they're not, sadly, often motivated by what they think is the right thing to do. They're motivated by power politics. And the mayor is the most powerful person in the entire state, arguably, maybe even more powerful than the governor at that point, because Mayor Daley, he can control the entire Chicago machine. And if you control the Chicago machine, you kind of control Illinois. I don't know. It sounds like you didn't get quite that same sense that people were actually legitimately persuaded by Cindy Buckmaster, and it wasn't just the money that was influencing the votes. And how did it actually die? Was it in committee? Did they just withdraw it? Do you remember how the bill actually died?
It was in the General Assembly.
Okay, so they actually got to a vote, and you lost.
Yeah, it did. Oh. And whereas there was a lot of nefariousness going on, because it should have been a done deal. It should have been done. But they made an exception for Envigo because they brought in their lobbyists. There was some backroom dealing. It was just nefarious as hell. And it was, yeah.
So are you saying they passed it and then they pulled it back somehow procedurally?
Yeah. It was.
Oh, that's super messed up.
Yeah, it was like a 12th hour Hail Mary that they took to have this happen. And yeah, you're so right, Wayne. I mean, yeah, I was following I wasn't inside what was going on with the foie gras thing, obviously. So I wasn't aware of all of this politicking that was happening, but I obviously knew about the Chicago foie gras ban and all that there were politics around it, but I didn't know what they were exactly. But I mean, it's all, these things happen, and people, like politics generally, I mean, I'm not here to talk about, Alka's take on politics, which is kind of, a little bit cynical.
That would be fun too, though. Having heard some of the debates you and your husband have, I kind of would be fascinated by your take on politics right now. But
yeah, I'd have to take off my PETA hat for that, since we're, a non-political NGO. Right. But yeah. But that's just demoralizing. And, obviously it's always the animals who pay the price, or human beings, vulnerable human populations, animals, the environment.
It's so weird to me, though, because we would go to these legislators, and this is not even dogs, this is ducks and geese, right? Yeah. And show them images of these ducks and geese being horribly abused. I mean, you cannot look at, and for the record, that same process that they use on ducks and geese that was banned in the city of Chicago is now banned in California, is the process they use of monkeys and dogs. Gavage. Right. When you're trying to force feed an animal, use this process called oral gavage. And it sounds like with monkeys, they go through kind of the nose as well, because the animal will not eat the substance otherwise. And with ducks and geese, they're force feeding them sometimes like 20 times the amount of food they normally want to eat. Their livers grow to like 10 times their normal size. And the animal's so broken and distorted and bloated that you throw away the entire carcass except the liver. The liver gets enormously fat, but the rest of the animal is just too fat, because these animals become morbidly obese. They're constantly vomiting their digestive pain. And so we'd show these legislators these things, and they wouldn't even, I mean, honestly, a lot like ordinary people who won't look at factory farm footage, they wouldn't even want to look at it and say, this is awful. But then they still voted against us, and without any sort of explanation. And it was mind-blowing to me, because I was a young law professor at the time, and I'm thinking to myself, I got to teach this new generation of law students that democracy matters. Our laws are written on behalf of the will of the people. It's not just money and politics and influence that lead to the political and judicial outcomes in this state and in this country. And then I'm seeing in real life how the system actually operates, and how legislators and judges and prosecutors will just kowtow to a powerful lobby. Because even before the foie gras ban was reversed, this law had been in effect, I think, for 9 months before it was reversed. And I think they had issued maybe one citation, and there were multiple restaurants that were absolutely just defying it. They're saying, we don't care. We're going to go ahead and serve foie gras. The way they were doing it was they were saying, we're going to serve it as a free side dish to an entree. Now, you'd pay for like $100 entree, and they say, oh, there's a side of foie gras. It's like, wait, I bought lettuce, and you got a side of foie gras for $100? $100 lettuce? And the city was just completely unwilling to enforce it. And it was so depressing to me.
Yeah.
And so this comes back to the original question. You keep giving more reason to be depressed, and yet this is a happy story. So how does this story become a happy story? I'm still confused. You lose in 2018. So,
Yep.
I interrupted you, so you didn't get to finish.
Oh,
But so how do
no.
we go from 2018, this demoralizing experience in the legislature where you see the power of money to corrupt everything, and then a few years later, suddenly everything's changing? So I interrupted. Continue the story. What happens in 2021?
Yeah. Well, I would say that part of the moral of this whole story, this whole saga, is that you don't want to make an enemy of Daphne Nikminovich, who's PETA senior VP, because this thing, went down the
I've
drain.
heard amazing things about her for so many people. I've never met her, actually.
Yeah,
I've
she's
heard
awesome.
so many great things.
Yeah, Daphne's really,
I think you're selling yourself short. I don't think you want to make an enemy out of Dr. Alka Chandna either.
Yeah, I do not forgive. Neither does
Especially
Daphne.
if someone is hurting the animals.
There it is, yeah. But Daphne, if you looked in the dictionary and saw the word tenacious, there'd be a photograph of Daphne right there.
Wow.
She kind of defines tenacious. And so she was not happy with the way things went down there in Richmond. And so she was very interested in, having an investigator placed at the facility. So in 2021, I think it was around April, May, an investigator got a job. A PETA investigator got a job at the Envigo facility in Cumberland, and she worked there. And as our investigators do, she took notes of everything she was seeing, took video footage, took photographs, did a really thorough job, and there was like a whole dossier of issues that came up through that, and it was the same thing, ramshackle conditions, feces piling up, mold growing on feces, and then, more directly associated with the animal welfare aspect was veterinary care, lack of veterinary care, unqualified personnel performing procedures on animals, these vulnerable animals. So sometimes these puppies, if they weren't thriving, they would be killed, which again is perfectly legal. It's up to the company. If they want to kill the animals, it's their prerogative. But there is an expectation that the killing method will be the least, the method that causes the least pain. And people were doing cardiac injections to kill these puppies without anesthetizing the animals first. And what I understand from veterinarians is that this is excruciating.
Yeah.
And that's what they were doing. Mother dogs who had given birth to litters, and these mother dogs are impregnated, they give birth to litters, the litters are sold off, they're impregnated again, and the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. It's basically a puppy mill, but the litters are being sold off to laboratories rather than people who really should know better than buying from a puppy mill. But these mother dogs, the facility wouldn't feed the dogs for a couple of days before weaning the puppies, and I mean, to see the video and to see what was going on was really awful, because the food would be there, and the food would be there, like right outside the cage, and the mother dog could smell the food, she could see the food, she couldn't access the food. And, she doesn't know what's going on. Some of us might fast, but then we know that we're going to fast for a day or fast for 2 days.
You have control over the situation, and it's hard. It's hard to do. That's why most people don't do it, because it's really hard.
Yeah, exactly. And you know that. But, there were just all of these situations where animals were really in a world of hurt. And
can I just put a pin in that too? Because I just think that is so evil that even in historical episodes where human beings have starved each other, which has happened, it's in jails, concentration camps, where for various reasons, we can name all the atrocities human beings have committed against each other. I've literally never heard of a situation where you're starving human beings and you're dangling food right in front of them en masse, that this is just standard operating procedure, that this animal is starving and they have no stimulation, they have no hope. and they have no expectation they're ever going to get food again. All they know is for weeks and months and years, this food has come out of this machine every day, and I get to eat. And I know, because I was recently in jail. Like, it's one of the few things you have to look forward to every day. That, you get really excited when you're sitting in your cell, because I was jailed recently, and 3 times a day, I mean, it would be way too early. Like, they'd come at 5:30 a.m. or 5 a.m. and wake you up, but you'd still be really excited because there's just something to do, and you get food. And you don't get enough food in these sorts of confinement situations. Yeah. And the idea that you would not only starve these animals, but have that food sitting there, dangling in front of them, so they know it's there and I cannot get it. That is just so sadistic and evil.
100%.
I sent you this chat. I hadn't actually heard about this until I read PETA's investigation. I didn't realize they're starving animals, because it's apparently to avoid this condition called mastitis, where they think because these poor mother dogs are being forcibly impregnated and have so many litters, they're developing these infections in their mammary glands that are quite dangerous and lethal. I mean, most commonly in the animal rights movement, we know about dairy cows, where mastitis is a huge problem. So many dairy cows. It's like a shocking number. I think it's at least hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dairy cows die every single year from mastitis. And their mammary glands get huge. I mean, sometimes to the point, like in dairy cows, their breasts are literally dragging along the ground, and because they're filled with pus. And this is pus in a mammary gland that is producing milk for a human being. But the theory behind it, according to Envigo, was, if we starve the animals before they're weaned, then they won't get mastitis because their milk production will decrease. And after all, we're taking their puppies away. And apparently there's like no evidence for this at all. It's just complete pseudoscience. And I looked into it and tried to find some evidence. This is actually based on some actual scientific research, and it's not. There isn't even a good anecdotal account describing why you need to starve an animal to prevent them from continuing to produce milk. And yet Envigo was doing this to hundreds, and over the years, thousands of dogs. Like, that amount of suffering. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing, the amount of cruelty in this system.
Yeah, well, I'm going to just say something nasty here and point out that, well, it kind of makes sense that an institution or a facility that is breeding dogs for a pseudoscientific enterprise, which is vivisection, would use pseudoscience.
Scientific evidence to raise the
everything that they do is such BS. It was in 1985 that the amendments to the Animal Welfare Act were passed. And, this was due to a couple of PETA undercover investigations way back. In the early 80s, it was the Silver Spring Monkeys case. And then also the University of Pennsylvania head injury laboratory using baboons that PETA publicized led to the 85 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act. And this was the first time there were animal welfare standards in U.S. For U.S. laboratories. And one of the things that came out of that was that it was proposed that there should be additional amendments. One, that dogs need exercise, and 2, that monkeys or non-human primates more generally needed some kind of enrichment for their psychological well-being. And the industry, the whole vivisection industrial complex, fought tooth and nail against these. And I mean, the vivisectors were even saying, I thought about this because of pseudoscience. The vivisectors were saying there's no evidence that dogs need exercise. Oh. And I mean, this is sort of the problem with that whole enterprise. Evil. Like, you have people today saying that without Harry Harlow's maternal deprivation experiments, we wouldn't know that mothers should pick up their infants, that it's a good idea to hold their infants, that we only know that tactile contact is good for infants because of Harry Harlow. The whole enterprise from A through Z is just obscene through and through. So it makes sense that Envigo was using pseudoscience, this notion of what you're talking about with the mastitis, to justify not feeding the animals. I mean, we've been in laboratories where they won't feed animals for an extended period of time, because they don't want to clean up the feces. And so they just, deliberately skip feeding because of that. They just don't want to do that work. And they say that, and we have them on video saying that. And it's it's horrendous. It's just, it's heartbreaking. These animals are entirely vulnerable. They have
One of the most
nothing.
disturbing things about the footage that your investigator shot in 2021, I was watching some of the videos, which I had seen back then too,
Yeah.
is it in the face of all this horrible stuff, like, little puppies being stabbed in the chest and stabbed in the head as they're screaming by non-veterinarians, right? Just
Yeah.
the reason it hurts so much to get stabbed in the chest and the heart is because your chest and heart are kind of important to survive. So of course you're going to feel pain, because an animal that doesn't respond appropriately when you're stabbed in the chest will die. And so evolution selects very strongly for animals who do not want to be stabbed in the chest. And certainly these puppies don't want to be stabbed in the chest or the head. But in the face of all this footage, the starvation of animals, the stabbing of these animals in the chest of needles, one of the veterinarians is talking to your investigator. I don't know if you remember this line. She's saying, like, yeah, there's all this bullshit we have to do, like not stab animals. And it's all just nonsense. We have to just jump through these hoops and ladders. And this is a veterinarian talking to a staff member openly about how she does not give a damn about any of these rules and regulations, how she's just trying to basically hide everything from the inspector, from the USDA inspector. And again, these are USDA inspectors who the USDA itself described as basically meaningless. We're not actually doing anything to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. And even after decades of basically meaningless inspections, the veterinarian, not just some random staff member, the veterinarian at Envigo is saying, yeah, we don't want to deal with any of this. This is all just nonsense. It's like mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing. I don't understand how someone gets in that state. And my only explanation is I think there is some self-selection for people who are kind of psychopaths. I'm not saying everybody, but especially the people who are kind of making the decisions. I feel the same way about prisons too. I think sometimes, it is the system, and there's like the famous Stanford prison experiment that you may have heard of, that like even good people can do horrible things when the norm's around you. But especially when you're talking about little puppies, I do think to a certain extent, both prisons and labs do select for people who just don't care about cruelty. They don't have, and I almost feel bad for them. They might just not have the actual physical capacity, the neurological capacity. They may have a damaged brain in some way that allows them to empathize with another living being. Because otherwise, how do you explain these supposed veterinarians saying, we don't care about animal care? Our job is basically to hide things from the inspector so we don't have to deal with all their bullshit. It's like their bullshit is ensuring these animals aren't stabbed in the chest, aren't suffering to death en masse at this facility with thousands of living beings. It's mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I agree with you, Wayne. And I think that I think your point about self-selecting is really interesting. And it makes me think about when I got involved in animal rights, it was between early to mid 80s. And at that time, my younger sister was in pre-med, and she was trying to pad out her resume, for her applications to med schools. And there was a job opening for an assistant in a laboratory at the university in my hometown, Windsor, Ontario. And so she she applied for the job and got the job. And I begged her not to take the job. I just said, no, please don't work in a laboratory. No, this is an animal lab where they were using rats and mice. And she basically told me to, stay in my lane, mind my own business, that maybe I had like this interest in this issue, but it wasn't her issue and she didn't care. And she went the first day and they took her over to a guillotine, like a small guillotine, and showed her how they, cut off the heads of rats and mice. And said, this is where you'll be stationed. And that was going to be her job for the summer.
Wow.
And she quit on the spot.
Wow.
But,
and these are live animals, for the record. They decapitate them live.
They're,
It's not
they're
an
live
anesthetized
conscious animals,
Yeah.
conscious animals. And that's permitted, to decapitate live conscious animals with guillotines, or as we saw in 2 investigations that we did at University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill, people were using scissors to cut off the heads of mice and rats. And this is why I get invited to the best parties. I just have all these great stories.
Yeah. You know who I know very well who used to do that when he was a grad student? My dad.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
But,
and it was one of the reasons, it was his first exposure. His exposure to animal rights wasn't even directly through reading anything. It was because he was not an animal lover at all. I mean, he had no exposure to animals at all, other than occasionally like a chicken would get their head cut off when he was growing up, but not very often because he grew up very poor in Taiwan. They'd eat like a chicken a year. I mean, they'd eat so few animal products. one of the kids' birthdays, they'd kill one of their chickens and eat some chicken. Otherwise, I mean, the chickens were too valuable for other
Yeah.
reasons. I mean, they had them for eggs, basically. But he said, when I got in and I had to hold this writhing animal who's clearly terrified. I mean, you can tell they're scared, and they know it's coming. They know, they can smell it, they can feel it. They're going to die, and I have to cut this animal's head off with a pair of scissors as she's writhing in agony. I immediately just intuited there's something wrong about this. This animal has some interest that I am violating. And it's funny because he told me because he was there around the time they invented the guillotine. I mean, we knew about guillotines. I mean, obviously, the French knew about the guillotine in the 18th century. They killed a lot of people with the guillotine. And it's so weird and disturbing that for the vivisectors, the guillotine was like, oh, this is like the humane way of killing animals, because we used to hold them as they writhe in agony, cut their heads off with scissors. And now we have this little device that's like a guillotine. That's, because it leads to fewer mistakes, apparently. But he always hated it. He said, I hated it so much. And this is someone, again, who was not an animal lover, had never read a book about animal rights, but just intuitively knew there was something wrong about it. And the moment he could get out of that as a grad student, he got out of it. And even when he was working at Eli Lilly, he only had one job his entire life. When he was in Eli Lilly as a junior researcher, he just dreaded being around the animals. He never wanted to come close. And I think maybe that's part of the reason he seeded in me, because it's such a weird situation, because he did continue to experiment on animals, and he did continue to use some of the results of those experiments. And he even showed me photographs of the experiments. But even when he was showing me photographs of like grotesquely mutated and abused animals, like my dad was researching diabetes, so they do weird things to rats to make them morbidly obese. And I still remember like seeing a rat the size of a bowling ball. He described to me what's happening, but the weird thing was he'd say, and this is, we need to do this because this is what's happening to human beings. Human beings are becoming diabetic and obese, and we need to do something. And I was like, and even as a kid, and I could tell even in his tone of voice, he had this weird self-recognition that, oh, this is so horrible what's happening to this rat. And that's why we need to do this, because it's happening to human beings, it's happening to rats. And it's like, wait, if this is wrong, then why are we doing it? It's like there was this weird kind of moral inconsistency even in his own work on a daily basis. And I got to think that a lot of the people who are not psychopaths must feel that same way. And we know some of them. I mean, Dr. Gluck, who you put me in touch with, is an example. This is a guy who experimented on primates for, I think, decades, or at least 10 years or more. And the entire time there was this part of him in his heart that was telling himself, like almost like a little angel on their shoulder saying, why? Why are you doing this? So
Yeah.
it's so mind-blowing that it happens, but it gives me hope that there are some people like my dad and Dr. Gluck who are able to change. I mean, that's remarkable. But
Yeah, this is like such an interesting discussion, Wayne, because, on one hand, there is like a sense that when somebody is doing things in laboratories, and especially, when they probably know that what they're doing isn't going to help human beings, or they're doing curiosity-driven experiments that are really just to like write some papers, and then, those papers get published, and,
and you get a job
they get
somewhere.
tenure, and, you get promoted and all this sort of thing. You make a nice career for yourself, you get grants, the whole thing. You see like our campaign, multiple campaigns, but Elizabeth Murray, who's an experimenter at National Institutes of Health, who inflicts permanent brain damage in monkeys through very invasive and painful means, and then, exposes them to realistic-looking snakes and spiders to see whether the portion of the brain that she mutilated and damaged has a role to play in fear response, that sort of thing. I mean, these sorts of things, first of all, there are human-relevant methodologies that can be used instead. But you think about somebody like Elizabeth Murray, and you think, every day for the past 40 plus years, she's, gotten out of bed and she's gone into the lab, and she's like looking at these monkeys. Like maybe in the 1970s, we didn't know so much about non-human primates, when she got started. But surely as time has gone on, and we know that these are profoundly social, very intelligent, sensitive animals who feel empathy, express empathy, are altruistic, and all of this other stuff, are matrilineal, that these rhesus macaques, if you're female, you live with your mother and your aunts and your female cousins and your sisters, your daughters, all of your life. To know about those social systems and just that, the cognitive abilities and the emotional richness, and to still go and do these things. I mean, there's definitely something wrong with that. But I also think, sometimes when I'm thinking about animal experimentation and the people who are involved in this enterprise, part of me thinks, here's somebody who had the luxury of an excellent education, like I did, this great luxury, and they could have done anything with their lives. And what they're choosing to do is be violent against these vulnerable beings, do things to these beings that they can do because they're stronger than them. They can take them and throw them in a cage and strip them of everything that would make their lives worth living. So they're basically these bullies on steroids. So part of me thinks that. And then part of me thinks, there but for the grace of God go I. That had I not, had a connection with my dog growing up, and thought about who are animals, and then learned that there was an animal rights movement, an animal liberation movement, and read Peter Singer, and learned that there were these groups, that there was this burgeoning movement, gotten videos and literature from PETA, when I was in my 20s, had not happened, my parents wanted me to go into biomedical sciences, and that could have been me. So and in that case, like Dr. Gluck, or some of these other people, like your father, you tamp down those voices that are saying to you, this doesn't feel right. Actually, like my colleagues, we actually have a video, or I should say a video was made profiling some of my colleagues, Emily Trennell, Frances Chang, and Amy Klippinger, all PhDs, and they did their PhDs in biomedical sciences of different sorts, and they all used animals. And so I'm having memory issues today. But the video is called Test Subjects. That's what it's called. So if people were to just Google test subjects, they'd find it. And, it is about that process where you are told by your supervisor that this is how you do biomedical sciences. We use animals so we can help human beings. And when you start realizing that that's really not true, that really what you have, as my colleague Emily says, what you have is this pile of dead rats and really no progress. Emily did her PhD using rats, and but there are people who have been in the lab using rats, mice, guinea pigs, rabbits, monkeys, other animals, dogs, cats, and they carve out careers for 40, 50 years. And they should know full well that they're not closer. We had a whole campaign down at Texas A&M University, a guy named Joseph Cornegay. In 1981, he realized that golden retrievers also had a condition similar to human muscular dystrophy, canine muscular dystrophy, that some golden retrievers would be afflicted with this progressive condition where their muscles begin deteriorating, so they really never are able to run, but then they have difficulty walking, their muscles are deteriorating, so they have difficulty swallowing, the esophagus, that muscle doesn't work well, and so they can't swallow, they really can't eat hard foods, they have to have, everything has to be a liquid gruel. They have difficulties even breathing, and eventually they die generally because of cardiac failure. The heart is a muscle. And so in 81, he started deliberately breeding these golden retrievers so he would have a colony of dogs who were afflicted with canine muscular dystrophy. And he would keep, at any given time, there would be 90 dogs in his colony, and he would be doing various experiments on them. So 81, till we shut down that lab, like we learned about the lab through an insider at Texas A&M, and they told us about this laboratory, and we went to work, and I think that was around 2013. We launched a campaign after trying behind the scenes to shut down the lab, and then we launched a campaign, and it was a 5-year campaign. But you can kind of do the math yourself. But he was at it for more than 40 years and didn't develop one treatment that would reverse the debilitating impact of muscular dystrophy in human beings, didn't develop a cure. Like, at what point does somebody look at themselves in the mirror and say, okay, I've told myself this fiction that I'm helping human beings, but really what I'm doing is adding to the amount of suffering in the world. It's a very strange thing. And, this all came from the veterinarian at Envigo, who, wasn't.
We should continue your story for sure, but I just want to comment on that. To me, there's kind of two types of people who are directly involved in animal abuse. And there are people like this guy at Texas A&M who seem like they're using the suffering of another living being to promote themselves. And they even expand. And I'd include Harry Harlow in this.
Oh, yeah.
Because I talked, John Gluck, Dr. Gluck, the professor at the University of New Mexico, who formerly experimented on macaque monkeys and now has stopped. I think partly because of your work and PETA's kind of investigations and just the education and relationship building that you've done such a great job with. But he actually worked under Harry Harlow, who's the person who did these evil maternal deprivation experiments where they subjected these poor baby monkeys to, evil robot monkey moms who just denied them attention. And yet still the baby monkeys would seek these doll monkey moms over food and water. They'd give up food and water to be close to a fake mom because they so desperately needed a maternal affection and touch. And I asked Dr. Gluck, what was Harry like? And he said, yeah, honestly, Harry never seemed to give a shit. He never cared about these animals. And it was almost like he relished the idea of performing more experiments on these animals. He wanted to expand it, and he did. He created this entire almost empire of primary research and trained all these students and developed all these production protocols and just thought, this is great, we're going to torture more. And Harlow's such an interesting example because he was studying, and this reminds me of what you were saying about Elizabeth Murray too, because she might be an example of this, just a powerful person who's not just expanding the suffering of animals, but they're studying suffering, right? So it sounds like Elizabeth Murray was studying terror. So every day she gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to go to work and cause terror to sentient beings. And Harry Harlow was waking up every day, going to work and saying, I'm going to study causing terror to baby monkeys who've been deprived their mothers and seeing how much they suffer. And then drawing inferences about human beings from that research in the same way that Elizabeth Murray is. It's like the profound moral inconsistency there. The idea that, okay, we need to study this huge problem in human beings. And again, a lot of times the results don't even extend to human beings because we're such different species. So it might not even be a valid result. And even if there are valid results, they're oftentimes completely trivial, like Harry Harlow's results. Oh, turns out mothers need to be around their babies. Mothers should carry their babies and touch their babies. It's like, bruh, have you looked around at the world ever? Have you ever looked at a child? Have you met a mom? Did you have a mom yourself? I mean, it's not some groundbreaking insight. And somehow it spawned this massive industry of primates, this one dude. And still to this day, I don't get it. But, I've been in Wisconsin a lot recently because of my troubles. But it's mind-blowing to me how much they celebrate this guy. They see it as this incredible scientific breakthrough and this genius who discovered something that no one else ever knew. And they don't even acknowledge the fact that it's almost like they institutionalize the sadism of Harry Harlow.
100%.
So
and
weird.
It's like the hubris of the vivisection industry and vivisectors is just so beyond the pale. We're all of us were so stupid that we didn't know that babies needed to be picked up and require tactile comfort. That came out of Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow started in the 50s, 60s. You're telling me that nobody in humanity, you think about in Africa, you see the way, women carry their babies in that blanket that's, in certain countries, in the blanket that's right next to their chest. I mean, that's not just it's not for feeding. It's that they hold the babies.
They want to be near their moms, of course.
No, the hubris is beyond the pale. And I mean, it's not just in this, in Harry Harlow's lab or some of these other like psychology laboratories, but even in the biomedical arena, you think about something like you talked about your father and insulin, or diabetes. And I'm from Canada, and I did my graduate work at University of Western Ontario, which is a massive vivisection school. And Banting and Best came out of University of Western Ontario, and they're hugely celebrated. And there is a massive vivisection lobby that's based in London, Ontario, which is where the University of Western Ontario is. And
Interesting.
They will talk about how it was Banting and Best's dogs. They did stuff where they removed the pancreas of dogs. And then the dogs developed a condition that's like diabetes. And, then they, saw the secretion that's insulin, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the crazy thing, and so you will hear to this day, you hear the, apologists for vivisection, the lobbyists and everybody else saying, oh, well, we wouldn't have insulin were it not for the dog experiments. And that's utter nonsense. That's just not true. What they've done is they've simplified the history of medical sciences and medical discovery. It was well before Banting and Best even came on the scene that people knew about the pancreas, even knew about the islets of Langerhans, which are, the little cells that secrete the insulin. They knew that from wartime, doing autopsies on soldiers who had died in the battlefield and had already developed some of these symptoms of diabetes. And from clinical studies, human patient studies, epidemiological studies, there's all kinds of work that had been done prior to Banting and Best. And all they did was, kill some dogs, and actually, like when they first injected the insulin that they took from those dogs and injected into a human patient, a 10-year-old boy, the boy died because they didn't account for the impurities that would, be seen as toxins to a human body.
Interesting.
Hubris. That is the word of the hour.
That hubris and that propaganda campaign that people like Harry Harlow were masters of spinning, that propaganda campaign, is the reason the second category of people involved in vivisection still do it, right? Like my dad. My dad is a deeply empathetic person. He's honestly like just one of the kindest human beings I've ever known. Like I've said this before, but he's the sort of person, someone will come up and say, can I have $100? He's like, oh, okay. And just doesn't, like he really does. He's just a really generous. What's that? You want me to come up? Yeah, no, he'd love you. I mean, you're the same sort of person though, honestly, Alka. You and Bruce are just so generous. You're the same sort of people. Like people come into your house and take your stuff and like, oh, take more, But he's such a nice person. But this doctrine of necessary evil that people like Harry Harlow spin, which is not true, I mean, frankly, even if these scientific results were valid, it's not necessary. In the same way that, there are a lot of people dying out there with kidney failure. They don't go out and just start murdering people and taking their kidneys and saying, necessary evil, I had to kill you and take your kidney because my kidney, and my mom died of brain cancer. And it was one of the most powerful things was for me when she was dying of brain cancer, was I showed her what people are doing in experiments about brain cancer to animals. And her conclusion was not like, oh yeah, great, let's go torture more animals and subject them to the same thing I'm going through. She was like, this is awful. How could anyone who knows what I'm going through possibly subject that to any other living being? That's not acceptable. Powerful. It's so evil. It's so evil what they do to these poor monkeys in my name. That's not right because I know how awful this is. So even if it were necessary, it's not justified. But a huge part of it is again, the false portrayal of these evils as necessary. And you go back to the Stanley Milgram experiments. I mean, one of the disturbing things about human psychology and why it's so important for us to be empowered to speak for animals is because all of us can be susceptible to that sort of influence. When Stanley Milgram was doing these, about the Milgram authority experiments at Yale? Yeah, crazy experiments, where he was basically inducing these just normal Yale undergraduates to shock someone in another room based on an authority figure, someone in a lab coat, like the scientist saying, you've got to do this, it's necessary for the experiment. And I think it was something like 80% of these students, when they were told you have to keep shocking someone to the point they're screaming and begging you to stop, and they've fallen silent in the other room, they would continue to shock them because they were just told it was necessary by an authority figure. And I think there's so many people in the industry who just feel that way. Your sister might be one of them. My dad was certainly one of them. John Gluck is another one. They're taught by these kind of honestly quasi-sadistic figures like Harry Harlow that you have to do this. And because he's influential, he's prominent, his name's on the building, he's winning these awards, even if his results are kind of stupid and everybody knows they're already true even before he found them to be true, you kind of have to comply. And that's such a scary thing in human psychology that we're willing to do that. But it's also why it's so beautiful when you see people fighting back, like what happened with Envigo, like what happened with some of the whistleblowers, like what happened with your investigators, and like what happened with Dr. Gluck. So I think that second category is the category we have to reach. We have to show them that this is not a necessary evil, that there is a better way to interact with animals, and that's by giving them compassion, not torturing them and caging them, but letting a macaque monkey live in the environment they're supposed to live, namely not in a cage at a lab. Letting a dog at Envigo or Ridglan have a family where they can love their family members in the same way that we all understand every dog. I mean, you've got 3 cats yourself. We understand how deeply these animals want to be around their families. They want to be loved and to love. And instead, we throw them in a cage.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. On the issue of necessary evil, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, the necessary part is such a lie, and it's a fabrication. I shouldn't say it's a fabrication. I believe that there are people that believe that. I know there are people who really believe that, but it's not borne out by the data. But it's just not borne out by the data. And, when you consider that 95%, and this is according to the National Institutes of Health, that 95% of all new drugs that are tested in animals and found to be safe and effective. Am I saying this correctly? That of all drugs that are found to be safe and effective when tested in animals, 95% are found to be either unsafe or ineffective. So there's a 95% failure rate. You just can't translate the data. And anybody with a dog would know this. We know that we don't give chocolate to dogs because there are toxic compounds or compounds in the chocolate that are toxic to dogs. And there are similar such, examples across the whole set of species who are used. And, and then it's also basic research. Most basic research or curiosity-driven experimentation that involves animals, the findings, even the highly promising findings, very, very rarely, like less than 10% of the time, make it to the human patient bedside, in the form of a treatment or therapy or cure. So we're talking about really poor returns for our investment, and a large part of that has to do with species differences, and then another part has to do with unnatural laboratory conditions, confounding factors, reproducibility crisis, this whole thing. And PETA scientists have put together something called the Research Modernization Deal. So if, folks who are watching your podcast or listening to your podcast are interested, they can just Google PETA Research Modernization Deal. I think PETA.org/RMD will get you there. They can see the strategy for phasing out animal experimentation in favor of non-animal human relevant methodologies that tend to be faster, cheaper, and more effective than using animals.
Yeah. And you sent me some of this research, but some of the top medical journals in the world, like the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, have been publishing some of these kind of analyses of animal research. And I'm looking at a couple of them right now that I think you sent me. A couple of them have been written by Pandora Pound, who's done just such tremendous work. But, a lot of these kind of so-called human relevant results are based on kind of one study, right? There's no systematic review. And anyone who knows statistics knows that if you do a study enough times, you're going to find a result that you want. It's going to happen just statistically, just by random chance. You'll do a study enough times, and the number of animals who have to die, the number of human beings that are probably dying based on these incredibly flawed results is just astonishing.
When we did our investigation at Covance, something that stayed with me from that, I mean, the whole thing stayed with me, but something that I recall from that investigation is that one of the employees there said, they were doing what I described earlier. So Covance was the contract laboratory. They would enter into contracts with pharmaceutical companies or chemical companies, or even back then it was household product companies, tobacco companies. They were using dogs and other animals to test tobacco products. But the pharmaceutical company, what they want is to get their product to market, right? So they want to go through the animal tests that at that time were required, the FDA required that animals be used in the testing process. That's no longer the case as of last year. But at that time, animals were required, but the pharmaceutical company wanted the test to go on to the clinical phases of testing in human beings. And so, if the FDA required a small animal and a large animal, the large animal would be either a dog or a monkey. And the small animal would be a guinea pig, mouse, rat, an animal like that. And let's say the mice studies showed toxicity. They would just throw out that data and then try rats. And if that didn't work, they would try guinea pigs, till they got ding, 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 oh, the compound is safe in this animal, so let's present this to the FDA. They wouldn't present the other data to the FDA. So it's all BS science. And you can't even call it science at that point. It's just, rigging the system to try to get your drug to market so you can cash in. And, I don't think that's what, the public expects. It's definitely not doing right by the animals. It's just obscene through and through.
Yeah, it is obscene. Okay, so continue the story with Envigo, though. And then we should talk about Ridglan before we close, too. So,
yeah, I know.
Because everything we've talked about is so depressing.
No. Okay, here we go.
All the bad science that's taken over the entire establishment by all the kind of regulators who are asleep at the wheel. In 2021, you do this investigation. How do we get to, it's in 2020, was it 2023 they shut down Envigo? Or 2022?
It was 2022.
Right? 2022. Okay, so how do we get from there to this investigation that PETA does in 2021 to a U.S. attorney actually pursuing charges against Envigo and shutting the entire place down?
Well, this is the crazy thing, and this sort of goes back to what you were saying about the USDA earlier, because we, had our dossier of materials, evidence indicating that that this facility, Envigo, was violating the Animal Welfare Act and its implementing regulations. Took it to the USDA, and the USDA, did a very good job of sending a team of veterinarians to the facility, and they did a number of inspections, documented 74 violations of the Animal Welfare Act, 74 violations over several inspections that they conducted after receiving PETA's documentation. And then they sat on it. That was the end of it. They just sat on it.
Yeah.
And luckily, somebody at Department of Justice started looking at this and, was asking questions like, why aren't you doing anything with this 74 violations? And these are serious violations. Why aren't you doing anything with this? And then the senators in the Commonwealth of Virginia wrote to the USDA, Betty Goldentire, veterinarian, and Bob Gibbons, another veterinarian, who were the top dogs at the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Animal Care. And they were saying, why aren't you seizing animals? Why aren't you opening an investigation? What's going on? And there were some other members of Congress wrote to the USDA asking what's going on.
Including Republican members of Congress, right? So this is Nancy Mace. She was one of them?
I believe Nancy Mace. I know Dina Titus took main role, but Nancy Mace is also somebody who cares about animals and dogs, and I think she also helped with that case. But the USDA. Can I ask you,
how did that happen? How did you convince the senators and Congress people to write to the USDA and the Department of Justice and say, hey, something should be done about this?
I think that no state wants the black mark of having a place like Envigo with 74 violations of the Animal Welfare Act, sitting in their state and violating the law and getting away with it. So I think the two senators, caring people and, wanted to see action. So, and again, it goes back to Daphne. She has good relations with people and, people's staff. She's cultivated relations over many, many years and, has, shown sincerity and shown that she's going to follow up and shown that she has tenacity and, the whole 9 yards, and that she will help legislators as well when they need help. So with those relationships, you can get some things done, like these letters were written. But in the end, it was really the USDA, did nothing. They filled out pages and pages and pages documenting obscene treatment of animals and violations of the law. But as I said, they sat on it. And then later, when PETA FOIA'd for correspondence, they saw that Drs. Goldentire and Gibbons, people whom I've met and sat with in meetings and whom, I held in a certain regard. But they were saying, yeah, don't do anything with this, let this die. And so basically they were kowtowing to Envigo. They were kowtowing to the industry. They didn't want to take a strong stand because they didn't want to, get blowback from the bigger industry that, wanted these dogs. And so we learned that that's what was going on behind the scenes. But luckily, the Department of Justice didn't feel beholden to the vivisection interests in the industry. And they brought legal action against Envigo. And, honestly, it was pins and needles. I was watching or listening in, on these via phone as these hearings were taking place. I don't know if that's the right legal term, to be totally honest, but there was basically Envigo's lawyers and the Department of Justice asking questions and so on. And Envigo was, trying to make cases in the case that they were doing everything that they could, and they were, et cetera, et cetera. And the judge was not.
I know that story very well because Ridglan's saying the same thing right now. Can I ask you one question before we jump into the hearing itself? Why did these higher ups at the USDA, when the senators, the Department of Justice are meeting with them and saying, hey, what should we do? Why are they resisting some sort of enforcement action when their own inspectors documented dozens of violations of the Animal Welfare Act? Can you explain that to me? Like what is the psychology there? Was it just literally we're scared, this is a big industry and they're going to target us? I mean, are they afraid they're not going to get it?
Yeah, okay. I think that's totally it.
What is the specific fear? Do you think they're trying to get a job after they retire from the USDA? Are they just going to have a bad reputation within the community of animal scientists and animal welfare people?
Yeah, I think it's having the bad reputation. I think that these regulators are afraid of the industry. They kowtow to the industry. We see that with USDA and the arm of the National Institutes of Health that is supposed to enforce animal welfare guidelines in laboratories that are federally funded. So it's sort of this fractured system of oversight. But we see with both bodies, the USDA and it's called the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, both bodies will kowtow. They, when an institution is like routinely, chronically violating these minimal animal welfare standards, they say, thank you for your concern for animal welfare. And it's like, what concern? These entities have zero concern. What are you talking about? But they kowtow entirely.
That is so messed up. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Mexican cartels right now. The most recent election, if you heard about
of course.
How things unfolded there were dozens of elected officials and candidates were assassinated by cartels.
Yeah.
And the elected officials, the people who are in law enforcement are terrified of the lawbreakers.
Yeah.
And when Papa Sue, the chief vet, this is the most powerful veterinarian at the Food Safety Inspection Service. He was running the entire show. When he told me nobody's willing to stand up to the exact entities that I am supposed to be regulating. I am supposed to be the person who's standing up against these industries for the public good. And no one, including me, is willing to stand up to them. It reminds me so much of like the Wild West in Mexico right now, where, law and order is deteriorating because you can literally just be assassinated if you disagree with a powerful, lawless industry that wants to sell people drugs. And similarly, with vivisection, these companies, and the same is true of factory farming. I've seen it happen where you can cite all the legal violations. You can look at the animal cruelty laws and say, you're not allowed to scald animals alive. You can't allow an animal to cannibalize another animal in your factory farm. You can't allow an animal to starve to death on the floor of your factory farm. You can't allow a little puppy, like this happened in Envigo, a little puppy to be trapped in the dam in between the two cages. She just falls into the pan where all the feces and urine is, and she's just stuck there covered in excrement. And it takes an inspector to say, like, hey, you can't just leave a puppy in a pile and pool of feces to slowly starve to death and die. And yet the regulators are the ones who are scared. You'd think that in the face of all these alleged violations of law, the industry would be the ones who would have some shame and say like, ooh, this isn't a good look for us, and ideally be afraid of enforcement action. But instead, it's the regulators themselves who are scared. That is so disturbing. And it's a fundamental affront, not just to animal welfare, but the rule of law.
Yeah, 100%. And, you sort of have to look at the history of the Animal Welfare Act and the relationship between the animal experimentation industry and the regulators. Because in 1966, when the Animal Welfare Act was first passed, it covered laboratories, but it only covered how animals got to a laboratory and what happened to their bodies when they had been experimented on and killed. What happened to that dead body. But everything inside, what happened in the laboratory itself, that was a black box. And there was actually like a section in the Animal Welfare Act that said that the secretary will have no say about what happens in the laboratory. And, the vivisection industry has always been and still is extremely arrogant. And they let that be known. They let it be known that they will determine what goes on in those facilities. It's, with the 1985 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act, when that black box was kind of exploded open, and then there were these standards and so on, the USDA will still, I mean, this is kind of getting into the weeds, and I don't want your, listeners to fall asleep while I talk about regulations. But there are loopholes, and you could drive a convoy of trucks through them. So the animal welfare regulations say you have to use pain relief, except if it interferes with a scientific requirements or whatever of the experiment. You have to look for alternatives, but you don't have to implement them. I've gone to conferences where, primarily it's vivisectors, and then there are always representatives from the USDA and from OLA, the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare at NIH. So these regulators, and the vivisectors are not kind to the regulators. They hate them. Yeah. And they let it be known, and they let it be known that this is their kingdom, this is their domain, and the USDA better back off. And, it's even encoded in the law in the sense that the USDA, it is supposed to enforce the Animal Welfare Act in laboratories and also, at circuses, zoos, puppy mills, other breeders and so on, exhibitors like SeaWorld and, these other places. So these other facilities like the exhibitors, the breeders, they have licenses. Research facilities, these experimentation facilities, they have registration. The difference is that the USDA can yank a license, but they can't yank a registration. And that is by design. The very powerful vivisection industry, when all of these laws were written, they said, we are going to have registrations, and the USDA has no say in this. Right to license they cannot take it away from us. So, yeah, I mean, okay, sorry, that's more depressing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, but I mean, there's a happy conclusion to all this, which is the DOJ does decide to take action. So you're listening to this hearing, you're hearing the arguments about kind of whether a complaint should be filed against Envigo and what the basis for that would be. What is the moment where you realize the government is actually going to do something, and what causes that in this hearing that you're listening to?
Well, it was pretty clear to me that Envigo was being really sleazy. There were statements that were being made where they were kind of whining about how much money they had spent trying to fix, the ramshackle, decrepit facility that they've been operating for so many years. Either they or Covance, from which, they purchased the facility. And, whining about, there was the pandemic, and so we had difficulty with this, that, or the other. Just trotting out excuse after excuse after excuse, in spite of the fact that the problems preceded the pandemic and continued after the pandemic. And I think the judge just wasn't having any of that. In spite of that, I didn't know until it was decided that, the place was going to be shut down, that Envigo agreed to shut the place down. And, and then it was obviously just last week. Just last week when we heard the decision of the fine, the $22 million fine. Half of that is for violations of the Animal Welfare Act. The other half, $11 million, is for violations of the Clean Water Act. And then there were the additional penalties, money that's going to the veterinary care of dogs, the 4,000 dogs who were rescued from the facility, and so on. They've also been required in the plea agreement. There's some directives to Innovative. So I know I've been talking for a long time, but I think this will be really interesting to you, Wayne, and to your listeners. Is that so? Innovative purchased Envigo, and just a little bit before all of this, came out, and so now Innovative is the one that is being forced to pay up these fines, and Innovative still operates, although they have said, they've agreed not to have a dog breeding facility at this point. They're not going to have any dog breeding facilities from here, through the end of time. They do have experimentation facilities, including one in West Lafayette, Indiana, which is where Innovative is headquartered. And HSUS, the Humane Society of the United States, actually did an undercover investigation there. But that facility focused on, it's been a while since I've looked at their video, but it's extremely powerful. They did a really excellent investigation, documenting, similar things to what we saw at Covance, the Covance Vienna facility, with the gavage and the monkeys kept in really small cages, going insane from the conditions of extreme privation and all of that. But so Innovative operates these animal testing facilities. It's also a contract testing laboratory. And as part of the settlement that was reached with the government, with DOJ and EPA, Innovative has to comply with a whole set of animal welfare standards, which the industry writ large is not complying with. These are increased standards, to ensure psychological well-being of non-human primates, for example, and social housing for social species, that sort of thing. Angie's kind of going crazy right now, but she needs attention.
She's excited about this result.
Yeah, she is. She's like, finally, the happy ending.
I didn't even realize this. So part of the settlement with the Department of Justice requires them to change the conditions for other animals that are not even dogs and not even in Virginia.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's fascinating.
It's really good.
So, and was it Judge Moon who issued this judgment recently? I actually don't even know. Okay. Yeah. Do you think this judge was just unusually sympathetic, or what happened that led to this fine, or was it that DOJ just asked for a lot more than normal? I mean, because again, going back to the way things normally are, in the entire year 2018, I think the number is like $130,000 in total fines for the entire industry. Over 10,000 regulated facilities, and all the fines across all 10,000 is just 130,000. You got one now where they're issuing tens of millions of dollars, granted split between the Animal Welfare Act and the Clean Water Act, but even just the Animal Welfare Act fine, I didn't know it was split that way, but even $10 million is like, that's 2 orders of magnitude more than they did the entire year in 2018. So why is it so big when it's always been so small through history? Is it just the judge is just like a good guy, or what do you think it is?
I think it's the DOJ.
You think it's the DOJ? They just pushed harder than they normally do.
Yeah. Look, I think the USDA has always, I think you also know Delciana Winders, who's a professor.
I do. She's amazing.
She's awesome.
She knows so much about the Animal Welfare Act. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, she's a scholar in that area, and she's published excellent work that discusses that when the USDA enters into settlements with laboratories, the labs are basically paying pennies on the dollar in terms of what the USDA is authorized to stipulate against the laboratory, how many thousands of dollars or more they could stipulate. It's $10,000 per the Animal Welfare Act. It's $10,000 per violation per animal. And so when you look at some of these stipulation reports, and you were to count up and just tabulate the number of animals, number of violations, etc., you'd be getting a massive figure. But the USDA has always fined the institution like just a small percentage of that, and as Delcy writes, pennies on the dollar. And part of this is like where the USDA, they're a government
imagine
agency.
we all got that when we had parking tickets or speeding tickets,
I know, right?
They just wrote off every time you get a parking ticket. Let's just write off 99% of it. It's like, wait, we don't get that. Why does this big industry get this? You can't just say we're not going to fine you.
I haven't done an academic study of this, but we monitor the enforcement actions as they're posted on the USDA's website every month. And, anybody can do that. You just go to their website and you look for enforcement actions, you find it, and you'll find that the majority, anybody could do it right now. Like you look through the enforcement actions, the majority of the enforcement actions against any of the facilities that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act, they're official warnings. What's an official warning? It's a piece of paper.
Yep,
that says bad institution. That's what it's saying, but it's nothing. So
a minority who got an official warning in December of 2023?
What was that?
Ridglan.
Yes.
Ridglan got an official warning because of dogs having their feet stuck in the wire. So, but you're right. It's like, but how many times, and they get warned about this every few years. It's been going on since 2016. They keep getting warned about, you can't let dogs just get stuck in the wire or have their feet stuck in the cage floor. First of all, raising a dog on cage flooring is terrible. And awful. But
awful.
The USDA does allow it, but you can't just consistently. And so you're right. It is just. It's kind of a rubber stamp that's masquerading as a warning. It's because you don't do anything about it. So what's the point of the warning when you don't actually? What are you warning them of? Other than the Envigo case. Again, the Envigo case is the amazing exception to all of this. But normally it's an official warning. And then they have that other thing. Delcy was the one who taught me about this because she wrote this piece about enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. And I know you know about this. There's that stage before even a warning, which is like a teachable moment, where
right.
Before you even warn them.
I'm happy to report that teachable moments have gone where they always belonged, which is in the dustbin.
That's right. I heard about this.
They can't do teachable moments anymore, which is great.
But that's wild. That for
ridiculous.
Was it for decades they were doing this? I think it was for many decades.
It was for more than a decade, I believe.
More than a decade. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, instead of enforcing the law, they'd say like, oh, it's a teachable moment, as if this big violent industry is like a little kid who accidentally peed the wrong place or like spilled a drink. They're treating these massive industries of such, literally kid gloves, because that's I think that terminology is even taken from educational psychology, where you have a young child who makes a mistake and you say, oh, this is a teachable moment. But it's not a young child. This is a massive, brutal, violent, multi-billion-dollar industry. And
exactly.
I wish actual kind of, convicts who are sitting in prisons got teachable moments too, because if every time one of these people actually got in trouble, they had a teachable moment, there would actually be some social benefit, because these people are not making billions of dollars, like someone who gets thrown in jail for a pot offense or something like that. Let's give them teachable moments, not a big violent industry. Okay, I didn't realize they had gotten rid of teachable moments, but that's great.
No, it's actually, something good that's happened. The USDA has historically, their thinking is they are a government agency. Yes, they have attorneys, but, their attorneys are not going to hold a candle to Envigo's attorneys, right? Mm-hmm. These multinational billion-dollar companies.
Corporations.
And so they feel that they are saving taxpayer money. This is their, I'm basically spouting what they say. They say they're saving taxpayer money by not entering into long legal proceedings. But the upshot of it is that they're failing, what the American public expects in terms of protection for animals. And when these, like your example of, somebody who's in prison for a pot violation is so perfect, Wayne, because, that's like somebody making a mistake or somebody, doing something non-violent, right? Mm-hmm. In the privacy of their own home, whatever it might be. But with something like Envigo, you're talking, or Covance or Innovative, you're talking about systemic issues that stem from really these institutions that use animals as though they're nothing more than inanimate test tubes that happen to have tails. That's really how they regard these animals. They regard these animals as machines that are going to spew out data, and it's a systemic thing that they're going to cage the animals in a certain way that's going to cause them harm, that they're going to conduct procedures on them that are going to cause harm, and then they're going to kill them. And so it's like this evil that's woven through the fabric of this institution. And for them to get a teachable moment or an official warning, a slap on the wrist, and to be regarded as customers rather than regulated entities is, I think it's a betrayal of the American public, and it's a betrayal of the animals, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to just unpacking how Envigo happened, you said that the reason for this massive fine is because DOJ was super motivated. Do you know this person, Mary Hollingsworth?
I don't know her personally, but I know her reputation.
Yeah, so I think she was one of the primary prosecutors who worked on this case.
That's right.
And she now works at Harvard Law School under Kristen Still, a friend of mine who's done just tremendous work. So is the explanation just that we happened to find...
Did you say that you know Mary?
I don't know Mary. I know Kristen, her boss at Harvard.
Oh, right, yeah.
Kristen Still's a professor of law at Harvard who's helped us out. She actually helped us out in the Ridglan case. She wrote an opinion just arguing that animals are some ones, not some things, and therefore we're entitled to the defense of others, the necessity defense on the grounds that a dog is not a thing. So
that's awesome.
Basically contradicting what you just said, the industry sees these dogs as just data machines. We know there's a difference between a dog and a machine. But do you think the explanation for how Envigo happened was just we happened to have the right prosecutor there at the DOJ? Like Mary Hollingsworth is just the hero of the story? Do you think that's the explanation? I don't know.
I think so. It's really? Like one person, but it's also one person who, then has like a whole team of people, and she's giving directives and saying, this is what needs to happen. But it's like, it's really somebody taking seriously their charge. That was a problem at the USDA. They wanted to kowtow. They did kowtow. And they wanted to, although they went through the motions of documenting the 74 violations, and good on the inspectors that went in. And I have all respect for them for doing that. But when they're the higher ups, the people in that hierarchy at USDA, the higher ups take all of that evidence and then just, file it. First of all, it's very demoralizing to the inspectors who did a good job.
Why would you do the work? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Did a lot of work to document all this stuff, and then they see that, that kind of amounted to a hill of nothing. So when you have somebody like Mary Hollingsworth who is taking her charge seriously and sees that this is a problem and that there has to be some kind of restitution here, then then the system works the way it's supposed to work. And I think that's what happened with Envigo. I don't think $22 million plus the additional penalties is too much. I think it's exactly right.
Much more.
And I hope it's a warning shot. I hope it's a warning shot to the rest of the industry that they need to take these regulations seriously. PETA has like a good number of investigators, and we are going out into the field, and we are going and placing our people. And, frankly, we could be anywhere. And we're not the only group that does undercover investigations. There are other excellent groups doing great investigations. And, we take our charge very seriously, to let it, to have hell rain down on these people who treat animals as though they're nothing more than data machines and a means to their mortgage ends. That's not why they exist on this earth. It's their lives, not ours.
Yeah. Here. Yeah, and I don't remember who told me this. It might have even been my dad. But when you start talking about seven figures, or I should say 8 figures, that's when the industry will start paying some degree of attention. Because I think PETA has done some of the research on this, but just the amount of subsidies the U.S. government gives the vivisection industry is in the billions. It's like, I think the estimate I've seen on PETA's website is $15 billion a year from the NIH, the NSF, just basically our taxpayer dollars going to subsidize various animal experiments. So compared to that $15 billion that's being subsidized for the industry, we need to start thinking about 8, 9, 10-figure fines in order to get these people to start taking these things seriously. And we're starting to see that happen, which is tremendous.
Right.
But
Yeah,
the other
the
explanation
15
for me,
billion, sorry, the 15 billion, and actually now it's more like 19 billion, is the NIH grants that fund
animal
animal
experiments.
experimentation.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But the other moral of the story, I think, is just the persistence of PETA over all these years. Because you started your story in the mid-2000s with these horrible abuses to monkeys at Envigo that were completely ignored and disregarded. And then you moved to 2017, where you have these USDA reports. A brave inspector finally, for the first time, files an inspection report saying there's these awful things happening. PETA uncovers it, and still nothing happens. And even when you get close to not even really helping the animals, but just improving transparency, you lose even on transparency. And you're not demoralized. And then finally in 2021, you go back and say, look, we're not going to give up on these dogs. We're going to send an inspector in. And then, the inspections, your investigators' findings are verified by the USDA's inspectors and nothing's done. And you still don't give up. So I think part of the moral of the story is, and the thing that ties all these strands together is that PETA and other animal rights groups, I think there are other animal rights groups that have been focused on Envigo and certainly the rescue. Shannon Keith and the folks at Beagle Rescue or Beagle Freedom Project did an amazing job helping all these beagles get homes. And I know the Humane Society was involved in that too. So it's not just PETA, but
Right.
PETA has persistently shown so much grit over so many years that has gotten to the place we are here. By all means, I think the USDA inspectors doing a diligent job was important. The fact that we got the right inspector who's going to willing to do her job. The fact that we found the right prosecutor who was willing to do her job. But fundamentally, the thing that tied all this together was what PETA did over the last 20 years. So thank you and your entire team for being so persistent in advocating for these poor dogs. And now all of them are free. And for the first time in history that I'm aware of, a facility is facing a fine that is actually financially significant. Like I've never even heard of this happening before.
Yeah,
that's such a huge victory for the animals.
It is the largest fine under the Animal Welfare Act, that 11 million.
And probably by a huge margin, right? Is there anything I've never even heard of $1 million fine.
No, neither have I. I mean, the one that I was aware of is, I think, a $75,000 fine against UW-Madison, Harlow's place. And then there was also a $50,000 fine against Huntington Life Sciences, which became Envigo. When it merged with Harlan and some other labs. So yeah, like the players are fascinating. It's sort of like this internecine little incestuous circle of vivisectors and these companies. But yeah, I feel like we see so much sorrow and so much misery and suffering and cruelty, in the work that we do. And to be persistent, and there are going to be setbacks every single day and, disappointments and that sort of thing. But, you have to take the long view. If you want to be in it for the long haul, you take the long view. And, and then there are days like last week from this recording where, we got the news of this fine and the penalties, and those are good days. And, they're good days when we see that laboratories are being shut down. The day when the Cumberland facility was shut down, when the dogs were rescued. And yeah, it was a massive undertaking. HSUS gets a lot of credit for what happened there, as does Beagle Freedom Project and Shannon Keith and the Humane Societies that, partnered with HSUS,
to get all those dogs homes.
The individual people, I just heard a great interview with somebody who was talking about decoding the ear tattoos to figure out what's going, who these dogs are and what the tattoos mean. There are like individual heroes, who have really stepped up. I sort of feel that, Wayne, that when we do the work that you do, that I do, that, this whole community does, we sort of see the worst of human nature the Envigos and the Huntingtons and these veterinarians who've sold out their profession, for a good paycheck, partnering with factory farms or, giving cover to the industries, vivisection labs, etc. We see the absolute worst, darkest, hearts of humanity. And then we see, the people who, work around the clock without pay to do, to uncover what's going on in these facilities. The people who, well, like you,
and like you too, and like Daphne,
people who risk their freedom, like you and your colleagues, to shed light into these darkest corners of our country and the planet writ large. But
inspired by PETA, Free the Animals was one of the iconic books for me. Animal Liberation and Free the Animals to me are still the most important books in the animal rights movement. This is a book written by Ingrid Newkirk about PETA's first big investigation and rescue too. It's like, it's such an amazing caper. If you haven't read Free the Animals, this is kind of an amazing book.
No, it's so good. It's so good.
Really
and it's a page turner.
Yeah, someone still needs to make a movie out of that. I know. I heard that Joaquin Phoenix is trying to make a movie out of it.
I think he bought the rights, or something like that.
He needs to give up those rights and give them to somebody who's going to make a movie because it's such
I think these things take time. Don't give Joaquin a hard time.
Give him shit. Yeah. I'm sure he's just taking his time trying to do it right. So I just want to say about Free the Animals, for people who prefer audiobooks, it's an audiobook as well, and Ingrid narrates it. So Ingrid's reading it?
Ingrid's reading it. So
great.
It's
she has such a great British voice.
Exactly.
So last two questions for me. One is, what do you think you've learned from all this at Animal Advocates, and then I specifically, because I don't know if you know, but exactly 1 month from today, I have to go before a court and argue for the Ridglan Beagles. So what have you learned that you could share with me and other animal advocates that I need to take into court on July 10th? Because I am in the same situation you were in a few years ago with Envigo. How do I convince this judge that we need to help these beagles?
Oh, I don't know that I can give you advice, Wayne. I mean,
come on.
I think it's pretty clear that your kindness, your sincerity, your dedication, your intelligence, all shine through pretty well. You had asked before about Judge Moon, and I'm sure he's a very kind human being. And the thing is, I mean, this is what I was thinking then, but I didn't have an opportunity to say.
And this is the judge in the Envigo case, Judge Moon.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That maybe he's a kind person. Maybe he has a soft spot in his heart for dogs. But it's also probable that he, like most people, have no idea, what goes on in these sorts of facilities. So being confronted with these sorts of things is kind of a wake-up call for them. And so they, so they use their authority to do right. And, I think that, going against Ridglan in a place like Wisconsin, could be a tall order, but
right, it kind of is. 10 out of the top 20 employers in Dane County, Wisconsin are in the biomedical industry.
Yeah, you've got Covance there. They've still got their Covance. I think it's called LabCorp now. LabCorp purchased Covance. But anyway, they've got their massive, that's their, since the Vienna facility closed in Virginia, they've got their massive contract testing laboratory in Madison. You're right. So there you go.
And since Envigo closed, Ridglan has started expanding their operations. They're I don't know if you knew this, but they're building out another facility. So it's a lot of money and it's a lot of power to go up against in Dane County.
To me, one of the silver linings in all of this is that reliance on animal methods is reducing, particularly in the toxicology realm, which is where a lot of the beagles are being used. A lot of dogs are being used, more so in toxicology than in, basic experimentation, like at universities, where it's just curiosity driven. Like, I wonder what happens if I, induce a heart attack in this dog while I'm running that dog on a treadmill, which is happening at Wayne State University. And our friends at Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine have a great campaign targeting that. But knowing that in the toxicology realm, you've got things like organs on chips and organoids and even artificial intelligence. being at such a level that we can reduce and even
we don't need to
eliminate
do this.
the need for using animals. I think
And by
that
toxicology testing, you just mean kind of basically forcing these animals to ingest
right.
toxic
Sorry,
compounds. That oral gavage style experiment
that's
where you're
right.
force feeding these dogs, Ridglan, for example, was things like laundry detergent, artificial sweeteners, all sorts of awful things
Yeah, I
that you're
saw your
forcing these
work on
animals to
that.
ingest and watching to
Sickening.
see how many of them die,
Yeah,
basically. And you're
yeah,
saying that's decreasing because there are these new models like organ on a
precisely.
chip, which is
Right.
amazing.
Yeah, and also, where pharmaceuticals are concerned, the FDA Modernization Act 2.0
Huge victory.
liberated pharmaceutical companies from having to use
requirement.
animals
Yeah.
as the data that they present to the FDA. And now there's FDA Modernization Act 3.0 that's being considered. We'll see where it ends up. But that would actually be a bit more muscular. So not only would using animals in such tests be discouraged, but it would be a bit more active that the non-animal tests should be preferenced. That's better for human beings. It's better, obviously, for animals, and it's just better across the board. So, I think that one way vivisectors have sort of pushed their agenda forward is by sort of holding the fear of Alzheimer's and other diseases up and saying, well, we're going to save you from all of this. Well, we can perfectly well see, anybody with sick relatives, I have sick mother, sick dad, anybody with sickness in their family can see that, in fact, the vivisectors have not helped us. They have not advanced cures or treatments for these various afflictions. So, what the hell are they talking about? And so I think that, the more that the Pandora Pounds of the world and these other people doing systematic reviews, demonstrating just how worthless the whole enterprise is, the more that we get people who are neutral, like judges and others, to come along. Will that happen in a month's time? I guess we'll see. But
We'll see.
But I think that you come off as so sincere, Wayne, and you know your stuff. And you obviously went into Ridglan, with the idea of documentation. I think that is so clear. And, I think that somebody who, whose heart was yanked out of their body and stomped on is the only person who's ever going to say that it was wrong for you to take Julie. So, I will be lighting candles, to all forces of good in the world and in the universe, that things go well. But I have faith. I have faith and hope.
All right. Well, my last question: have you gotten to meet any of the Envigo Beagles that you've worked so hard for so many years?
I have not, and it's very sad to me. But some years ago, in 2015, so almost a decade ago, we did an undercover investigation at a place called PLRS. In North Carolina, Cora Peak, North Carolina. And that was a contract lab that used dogs and cats, rabbits, to test companion animal products. And that investigation also resulted in the closure of the facility. And all of the animals were taken out and adopted out. And there was a cat named Ruby who was adopted by my friend Jared Goodman, who at the time, he's an attorney for PETA, and at the time he lived 2 blocks down from us, from the house that you come and visited us at. And he lived, 2 blocks down. And so, they would come and take care of our animals if we had to go somewhere, and we would reciprocate. So I had many opportunities to hang out with Ruby, this beautiful cat who passed away about a year ago. And there was, she died loved and in a home where she, knew comfort for many years before she passed. And then a dog from PLRS went to one of my colleagues, Jessica Sandler, who started PETA's regulatory testing division of scientists that, promote non-animal testing methods and regulatory reform so that non-animal methods are promoted and used. And she adopted a dog whom she called Liberation, Libby for short. And I had visited Jessie when she lived out in Boulder, Colorado, and there was a conference there. And so I stayed with her and got to hang out with Libby, and that was really, really awesome. And yeah, Libby had, many really happy, good years of being much beloved before she, went and crossed the Rainbow Bridge. So,
It's a life that all these animals deserve.
Yes, yeah. So I have had the privilege of seeing the resilience in animals who have been, kept in such miserable conditions and treated so abysmally and so violently, and then, had a second lease on life thanks to the work of undercover investigators who are the ultimate heroes in any story, like you.
Well, I mean, it takes a huge team, and like I said, a lot of it was actually a PETA employee who first put Ridglan on my radar.
Oh,
Jeremy
interesting.
Beckham,
Yes,
many years ago, because he lived in Madison. So
yes, that's right.
And a lot of other groups, that did so much research that helped us establish that Ridglan was an appropriate place to do an investigation. Well, thank you for your work for so many years, Alka.
Thank you.
You have a standing invitation. If you come to the Bay Area, please let me introduce you to Julie, the beagle we saved,
love that.
and let me treat you to many meals, given the many times you've been so generous to me. And let's hope for not just the beagles of Ridglan, but the monkeys that are being tortured at Margaret Livingstone's facility, the animals being tortured by Elizabeth Murray in these horrible fear experiments, that we find a path that's more compassionate than the one we've been on so far. And
my
the
mantra
people on your
is
team.
TikTok. I think time's on our side, and I think we're going to prevent.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you so much, Alka. Until
Thank
next
you,
time.
Wayne.
Okay. Bye-bye. We don't have to hurt animals. We can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.